Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 4th edition of AFRAA's Sky-Connect Leadership Dialogues. Good morning or good afternoon to all from AFRAA, from a pleasantly warm Nairobi. Every month, AFRAA Sky-Connect Dialogues series hosts a top executive from the aviation, tourism, trade, and financial or economic sectors for a thought-provoking one-on-one dialogue on matters relevant to aviation development. Expect nothing but out-of-the-box thinking and far-reaching recommendations to shape African aviation. My name is Maureen Kahonge, Senior Manager, Business Development and Communications at AFRAA. Joining us today on stage is Mr. Romain Ekoto, Chief Aviation Officer at the African Development Bank. Romain is an aviation professional with more than 19 years of experience. As Chief Aviation Officer of the AFDB, Romain is responsible for developing and executing the bank's framework to support the aviation sector in Africa. In today's session, Romain will share perspectives on the role of AFDB in supporting African aviation sector, the role of AFDB in investment in airlines, governments versus private sector, the support of AFDB on safety, capacity building through the AFCAC-AFRAA-IATA tripartite agreement under the framework of the Single African Air Transport Market implementation. He will also share with us AFDB's expectations on the African Continental Free Trade Area. This and much more lined up in today's discussion. The session will be moderated by Rafael Kuchi, AFRAA's Director, Government, Legal and Industry Affairs. A few housekeeping announcements before we start, and I hand over to Rafael. For better quality of the session, all audio and video functionalities are disabled except for the speakers, but we will be receiving your comments on the chat, and your questions and answers should be sent to us through the Q&A tab, and we will answer the questions as we proceed during the session or at the last part of the discussion. Please let us know through the chat function where you're joining us from. And now, ladies and gentlemen, sit back and stay tuned for a very insightful 1 hour. I now hand over to Rafael for the moderation of the session. Rafael, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Wherever you're joining us from, you're most welcome to yet another edition of AFRAA Sky-Connect. Today, as Maureen indicated, my guest is Mr. Romain Ekoto, and together we would be having a chat on a number of issues bordering on African air transport and the aviation industry in general. Mr. Romain Ekoto, you're most welcome to the show. You may unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much, Rafael. And thank you very much to AFRAA for inviting me and the African Development Bank to participate in this interesting conversation.
It's our pleasure, and we thank you and the bank for accepting our invitation to join us today. As Maureen indicated, we would start with, I'm sure some of our guests are probably not very familiar with the African Development Bank and its functions, and why, as an aviation organization, AFRAA would want to be talking to you on this particular show. So I would want, for starters, for you to tell us briefly about yourself, and then also something about the bank and how it interfaces with air transport. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. So, few words about myself. I'm a civil aviation engineer by education. So I was trained in France. And after my civil aviation engineer diploma, I joined the French airline Air France in Paris. where I used to work for the operations department. And after Air France, I joined ICAO. So I moved to the industry, from the industry to the regulatory side. And with ICAO, I was in charge of technical cooperation for Africa. So I was stationed in Montreal for 2 years. And then I moved to Dakar, where I continued to manage the technical cooperation program of ICAO. Basically, the technical cooperation program of ICAO is geared towards supporting countries complying with ICAO and countries' regulations, aviation regulations. And I also worked on the air transport program of ICAO while based in Dakar. And it's after Dakar that I joined the bank. This was exactly 3 years ago, because I started on the 2nd of June. So this is my 3rd anniversary with the bank. And this was actually the creation of, this was a new position. And if you wish, the bank was actually created sometime back in 1964 with 80 member countries. Is the first multilateral development institution in Africa. The bank has invested more than 90 billion of lending over the past 20 years, and 20% of this was actually dedicated to transport. The overall, I would say the overall objective of the bank, of the African Development Bank, is actually to support sustainable economic development and social progress in its regional member countries. When I say regional member countries, I'm talking about African countries that are all members of the bank, and thus contributing to poverty reduction and basically supporting the SDGs. And to do so, the bank actually either mobilize and allocate resources to countries or provide policy advice and technical assistance. This is actually very critical for the aviation sector, but now I'm still talking in general terms. And we have 3 instruments for this. So we have the African Development Bank instrument, which provides loans to private and public sector. And these are very close to commercial banks' interventions. We have the African Development Fund, which provides loans and grants, but in concessional loans. Concessional loans means long maturity, usually 20 years or more, with reasonable grace period, and also provides and very low interest loans, and also provides grants. So most of the grants provided by the bank would actually be coming from this instrument, the African Development Fund. And the third one is the Nigerian Trust Fund, which is also managed by the bank. The bank, for now, is guided by 5 major strategies that were developed by the president. One is Light Up and Power Africa. This is related to energy. The other one is Feed Africa. This is agriculture mainly. The third one is Industrialize Africa. And this is where transport intervenes in this high five, is actually about improving the supply chain and fostering innovation in ICT. And the fourth one, Integrate Africa. Again, transport is a strong supportive of this priority, in the sense that transport will strengthen infrastructure links and reduce administrative barriers. And the fifth is improve the quality of life. The last word about what the bank does is that under this high-level strategy, we have regional and country strategies. And what is really important is that all our projects have to be aligned with those strategies. And in addition to that, for the aviation sector in particular, in the bank, we actually developed in 2018, just after I joined, a specific framework and guidelines for the aviation sector. And I'll further develop on this as we go through the conversation.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, aviation industry, we've always counted it as contributing significantly to the continent's development. And as the bank's role is to alleviate poverty and improve the living standards of the citizens, you mentioned that transport is a key pillar to drive some of these initiatives. And so the bank has a focus in there. Now, when you look at African aviation, many of the airlines are weak. The infrastructure supporting the aviation sector is also poor in most cases. And oftentimes the cost of operations are high. are these perspectives the bank is looking at?
Thank you very much for this interesting question, because in fact, looking at those barriers was actually the first step that the bank undertook in working on a framework and guidelines to support the aviation sector. Because we realized over the past 10 years, the bank has actually invested close to 10 billion in the transport sector, in the aviation sector, sorry. And 75% of this was to support infrastructure, while 25%, 20%, let's say, went to aircraft acquisition. And the last 5% went into policy, institutional support, technical assistance to the aviation sector. But the bank did identify basically 5 barriers to the proper development of the aviation sector. And these are those that you actually mentioned: the weak airlines, the poor infrastructure. But just a few words about what we perceive as being the reasons for the weaker airlines is that we are actually operating in a highly constrained market where costs are considered to be pretty high compared to the other markets. When you look at, the main cost factors for the aviation, for airlines typically in Africa, when you look at fuel, crew costs, maintenance, airport, ANS charges, we came to the conclusion that we're basically between 25 and 30% more expensive than the world average. And it's even worse when you compare it to low-cost carriers. So this is about high cost for our airlines, and as a result, they have challenges, reaching profitability. And this is affecting their ability to leverage resources on the market for financing their fleet renewals, and also the other challenges that they are facing are related to governance. This is something that we've been talking about a lot, but one of the realities is that those airlines have challenges in developing robust business plans, which are required for them to be able to leverage resources on the market. So they end up either not having access to financing or having very tough conditions compared to the market. And this is affecting greatly their competitiveness. You also mentioned, and this is true, the infrastructure. So poor infrastructure is, again, another challenge for us, because when you look at the airports, non-compliance with international standards, and this is, increasing safety risks. We also have operational issues at our airports that are affecting the quality for both users, passengers, and airlines. And we have at times also capacity constraints that do not enable the market to grow as we would like it to grow. Another issue that we're facing in Africa is the connectivity. This has been discussed at many occasions, and I'm sure we'll still discuss it today. And what we observe is that the connectivity level is very low, and this is also affecting the profitability of our airlines. Just one figure that we have, because the bank conducted a study on this, we have evaluated approximately 1,400 possible country pairs in Africa. And pre-COVID, we only had about 16% of those links operated by airlines. So this is about less than 200, basically, less than 200 direct links in existence, whereas we have about 1,400 possible. And compared to, let's say, Europe, we have 65% of links existing, and Latin America, where they have 50%. So we still have a very long way to go.
Okay, thank you for that elaboration. You said about 75% of the bank support for the sector goes towards alleviating the infrastructure deficits that we have on the continent. Now, there has been some school of thought that the bank's focus is to do infrastructure development and not support airlines, because infrastructure is not necessarily consumed by only African airlines, but by all airlines. So when you support infrastructure, you're not necessarily Africa, but you're supporting global aviation. And their thinking has always been probably the bank should look at tilting some resources towards other sectors that are equally in deficits, rather than putting so much on the infrastructure side. What would you say? Would you agree or disagree with this thinking?
You see, as I said earlier, one of the reasons why the board of the bank actually requested the management of the bank to develop a framework and guidelines to support the aviation sector was that we really needed for the bank a document that will better articulate the way the bank is supporting the sector in Africa to avoid such, interpretation of the bank's interventions in the sector. One thing the view defined by the president and the aviation sector is really for the bank to act as a catalyst to support the aviation sector effort. The bank has experience in financing large projects in Africa, so we really want to transpose this experience to the aviation sector. Now, in the way the strategy and the framework developed really considered which kind of interactions would require the bank, or the bank would have an additionality, because again, as a development bank with the overarching objective of poverty reduction, we have to be consistent when we approach our intervention in different sectors. So looking at that, we could identify and we could see that there are different type of investment in the aviation sector. Some of them be very capital intensive, which is the case of infrastructure. Whereas there are other areas where commercial banks can come in. Now the bank is here to facilitate the access of the sector to the private. This is really our objective, not to take over the private sector's role. So from that, we've either the type of projects in which the bank would intervene and which resources would be used by the bank to support the industry. Typically, we have observed in cases airlines were state-owned, and in this case, state would recourse to the bank financing to finance aircraft acquisition. This was possible in the past, but this is not possible anymore because we consider that the commercial market is able for the now. I will agree with you, and as I said before, the performance of our industry doesn't enable others to access those resources in the private sector. So the bank to actually transform the industry, because again, it is really committed to support the transformation of the industry to enable it to be more attractive for the private sector. And this can be done through technical assistance, as I said, supporting in developing more robust plans, supporting in capacity building, because again, human resources is key and critical for a strong and vital industry. So the bank, in our framework, we've clearly identified what kind of instruments will be preferably dedicated to the different type of projects. And I can give you some examples. Airport project, we would rather have public sector financing supporting the air infrastructure. This is the runway, tower control, and those kind of things. Whereas we would we would prioritize the private sector investment for the airport land, no, not the airport like access, but the airport terminal, for instance, because on this one, you have the possibility of concessioning infrastructure later on. So PPPs will be favored, the private sector will be encouraged to participate. Another example is aircraft acquisition. we will not use public sector resources anymore to finance aircraft acquisition, but we have guarantees products that can be used in this respect. So again, the idea is really to facilitate the access to financing, but not to take over the commercial bank's role in the business.
I think the challenge here for many of the airlines in Africa is that commercial financing is quite expensive and out of reach for many of the airlines, considering that the cost of operations are high and the margins airline earn are very slim. So if they go for commercial financing, it will be very difficult for them to pay back those loans. And so they mostly would go for them to bridge and meet their short-term requirements rather than long-term financing because of the high cost. And that is why the thinking has always been, if we could have development institutions such as the African Development Bank, consider sort of aircraft financing and long-term investment in the aviation sector as part of infrastructure development for the sector, it could actually push aviation to the next level and now allow airlines to compete more effectively. And that is where it's coming from. It's true we can go for commercial financing, but the cost will not, would actually worsen the state of African airlines. So to, I don't know, yeah, go ahead.
You know, we do recognize this challenge, as you said, you know, the challenges for airlines to access the financing. And one of the issues that the bank is working on is actually to facilitate the access to financing through leasing. So in this respect, the bank has commissioned a study, a feasibility study for the creation of a leasing platform. And the purpose here is really to say, we recognize that our airlines, except a very few, have even difficulties in accessing the newer aircraft on the leasing market with reasonable premiums, because usually the lessors will either not even want to deal with some of the airlines or some of the countries in general, or they will actually charge more, they will ask more securities. And this is, again, very heavy of the finances of our airlines. So the purpose here for the bank was to try and find out a solution where we would de-risk transactions for African airlines, provided, of course, those African airlines also come up with a strong business plan. So really, what we have to do, I mean, from our industry part is really improve our business plans, improve our governance, and this will also help, you know, institutions like the African Development Bank and other partners that really want to support the market, because, you know, we had this conference in December where we invited different partners, and we really all can sense that there is a will, there is an interest for supporting the market. But again, because the projections are very good, the traffic growth, especially if we manage to implement the liberalization as we're looking at, the prospects are very good. So we really need to make sure that we're doing what, I mean, to make sure that we can support the growth of the market.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned that the bank is favorably disposed towards considering support as long as it is state guaranteed. Now, so is it the airlines who are actually not pushing their governments hard enough for them to provide them the necessary guarantees to reach out to the bank, or the bank itself has a process to go through that airlines are not familiar with?
Okay, the bank historically has been more demand-driven, i.e. the bank would avail, you know, communicate on its instruments, and it would be for states to decide on their priorities and solicit the bank's support. So in this respect, and this is actually applicable to the whole aviation sector, my observation after 3 years with the bank and looking at the history is that you will have some states that are really familiar. And when I say the state, is the whole departments of the government, and particularly in the transport sector, that are very familiar with the bank's processes and will solicit financing. And there are other cases where, unfortunately, you will have some part of the industry that is in need, but will not necessarily go through the proper channels for different reasons to enable the bank to actually provide proper support. And unfortunately, I mean, communication has been made at the sector's level. But what I also try to do, as I said in the introduction, is that we have the regional and at the levels, we have what we call country strategic papers. And we have to ensure that aviation infrastructure is included in those strategic papers, which usually span over 5 years, to enable down the road aviation projects be actually considered by the country. Because once the country defines its strategy with the bank and there is no window, there is no opening for the aviation sector, it becomes more challenging even for the aviation professionals in the country to solicit the government to request support from the bank. And the only entity in the government that can request support from the bank is the Ministry of Finance or Economy, depending on the country. So this is very important. This is an important message for our sector, is that soliciting the bank by the sector will very generally not yield any result. It has to through the only authorized person, who is the Minister of Finance or Economy.
Thank you. I think this clarity is very important for the airlines who might be listening, or other aviation sector players that might be listening to this conversation, that if you want to get funding from the bank and you want the bank's ear, please first get the ear of your Minister of Finance or Economy, and through your Minister of Finance or Economy, they would approach the African Development Bank on your behalf, and that might yield you better results than trying to do so directly or through your sector ministry. But having said that, now we are seeing that there's also, it appears that there's also no strong appetite for investments in African airlines. I'm not too sure whether the bank has done some evaluation on this and quite probably have some ideas on why it is that the particularly African airlines are not very attractive to foreign investors? Or is it rather that the African airlines don't want to get external investments into their businesses? What is your take?
Okay. This is interesting because we've been looking at the regulatory framework of the YD, and as you know, there's one restriction on foreign investments, and this is actually probably motivated by national interest, but there are restrictions on foreign investments, which is related to ownership and control of airlines. Our view, again, as I said, is that just like any business, in order to attract investments, including foreign investments, you have to make sure that the regulatory environment is robust enough. So one thing that we identified as the requirement, for instance, from the bank's perspective, before looking at any investment in aircraft acquisition, is the signatory. The country has to be a signatory of the Cape Town Convention. So this is for us a must before we can proceed. And of course, the SAATM, but I'm sure we'll discuss the SAATM later on today. Now, with regards to these restrictions for foreign investments, I think it's really something that, it's a sensitive matter, but it's something that has to be considered very seriously by our countries, because ultimately, what are we looking for? I think we're looking at providing air transport service to our travel people. Really have to make sure that we have the proper regulatory framework in place to ensure that even if the foreign investment, the benefit for the country is protected, because we create labor. We also actually taxing for the economic benefit for the country, must be preserved, and this can be ensured via the proper regulatory framework. Also, and we discussed about it earlier, from the bank's perspective, when we look at a financing request by an airline, the first thing that our credit risk office will look at is what has been the performance of this airline over the past 3 years. Has the airline been profitable or not? If not, then we will not proceed. Now, we have some thinkings, not just the bank, but in general, the sector, about looking at different securities, because again, an aircraft, if the aircraft is easily remarketable, this is something that can be security. And combined with the financial performance of the airline, this might enable easier access to financing. So these are the areas that we are exploring from the bank's perspective, but also with other financial partners to see how we can help in this respect. Talking about airlines, for the past, in the past years, we saw that also ECAs had reduced significantly their presence, their financing. Now, more and more, when we discuss aircraft acquisition projects with airlines, we see the presence of ECAs. So this is a positive development. And with the ECAs covering, between 80 and 85%, then you only have about 15% of the project cost that is to be covered. And the bank can actually support this, but also actually act as a syndicator. So facilitate the mobilization of other financial partners on the project. And this is the evolution that we can see, and that should enable the bank maybe to support more aircraft financing in the future. But as I said earlier, really, we don't want the bank to, presented as a leader in the aircraft financing area, although there is a need. So we really want, on one hand, to push the leasing platform where we'll enable African airlines to have access at competitive rates to leasing, to lease aircraft and also spare parts. And on the other hand, we want to see how we can facilitate and support those airlines in improving their business plans, improving their governance. And this is really part of the dialogue that we have with countries. How can we improve the environment for our airlines? One of the issues we discussed about earlier was the high costs. Usually when we talk about high costs, we also actually talk about taxes, fares and charges. Not later than last week, I attended the ECOWAS meeting on how to improve this issue. And this meeting came up with some interesting solutions, including the development of regional policy to address this issue in the ECOWAS region. I know the same efforts are also being undertaken, I think, in the EAC region. But ultimately, we really need to address all those issues that will improve the ability of our airlines. And this is definitely one of the key ingredients that will enable them to access finance. And this is where maybe the bank can play a role in supporting those efforts that will improve the attractiveness of our industry.
In fact, the airlines in Africa would be very much happy if they can be able to access leased aircraft at competitive rates, because today that has been one of the biggest challenges, and resulting in many of them operating aircraft that are not so good to operate in some cases, and in other cases quite expensive to operate. So it's heartwarming that the bank is looking at supporting a leasing entity. We probably would just want to see how soon we can work with the bank to ensure that we bring this to reality, so that we can ease the benefit, we can ease the burden on airlines. As you appreciate today, as we work towards the single African air transport market, if we open up our markets and we don't have the equipment to be able to support operations, we would not have achieved much together. So I don't know whether you have some timelines, you have some partners you're working with on the leasing platform. Any updates?
Yes. So this initiative, I've been pretty worried when talking about it for the past year or so, because the initiative has been, on standby, so to say, because of some challenges within the bank. But happily, all of those challenges have been now addressed and resolved, and I think we'll be able to kick off the study within the next couple of weeks, and the implementation the implementation period is about 4 months. So we're now in June, so very likely by September, October, we should be able to have the conclusion. But again, you see, just like we did for the bank's framework and guidelines to support the aviation sector, we really consider this initiative as a transformative project for the aviation industry in Africa. What we intend to do is, although we've entrusted the realization, the conduct of this study to a consultant, we intend to bring together stakeholders from the aviation industry in Africa, but also that have interest in the leasing markets together to really look at the solutions that will have been proposed by the consultant before the bank goes for the final solution. Because we want a solution that really is realistic, that is practicable, and that will really impact positively the market. And we can only do so by bringing in, those who have the know-how, who have been exposed to this, and who can really help us in, building a robust and efficient solution for the market. So, our plan is to bring to organize a workshop towards the end of the study to discuss this openly with different stakeholders before we conclude the study and take it to the next step, which is the actual establishment of the solution that will have been retained. Just a quick word on this. When we talk about leasing platform, really we're using the term platform rather than leasing company, because, as I said, the objective is not necessarily to create a new leasing company in Africa. The objective is to de-risk leasing transactions for African or lessors. So we end up deciding the best solution is actually for the bank to establish a guarantee product that will be made available to our airlines, and we'll still use the same lessors globally because they have the fleet, because they have scales, they have all the requirements to be able to provide the solution. They just need the de-risking to be able to reduce the cost for African airlines. So this may be a solution, or we may decide to support an existing leasing company in Africa to grow, to be able to meet the requirements of the market. So it's really an open process.
Yeah, now I think this will be a very good initiative, and as you said earlier, count AFRAA in. We are ready, willing, and on standby. We cannot wait to jump on to the discussions, workshop, to actually iron out the necessary teething problems and get this one up and running. Our airlines need it more than ever before, and we look forward to it coming live on stream. But let me divert a bit, and then we talk slightly about the single African air transport market. I know the African Development Bank has been very supportive of this initiative right from start, and has even committed some funding to support the setting up of the executing agency and provide some capacity building. Can you throw some bit more light on this?
Yes, thank you very much for this question, Raphael, about the single African air transport market, which is a major initiative of the African Union Commission. So as you know, well, just a quick background, why did the bank actually got involved into this? We realized that there were many initiatives in the past that were launched, but didn't necessarily materialize for various reasons. And the YD is actually one of those initiatives. Also, there was this high-level panel, driven by the President Paul Kagame, who came up with a number of recommendations. One of them being that the organization should focus on key priorities with a continental scope. And these are really the reasons why the bank considered the SAATM, just like the bank is also supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area. And also realized that the AFCAC was entrusted with the responsibility of implementing as executing agency this initiative, but the AFCAC didn't have the resources for this. So again, this would not have materialized without a support, and the bank is actually really, the bank took it as a responsibility to get involved into this important project. And our objective here is to improve access. When supporting this project, our main objective was to improve access to air travel for African travelers. And this is by supporting the AFCAC to fulfill its mandate as executing agency of the YD and the SAATM. And the way the project was designed is actually also very interesting, because we're providing resources up to 7.5 million approximately to the AFCAC. Of course, AFCAC is also contributing to the project. And I think this is also important to show that despite their limited resources, AFCAC is committed also for the success of this initiative. Now, the initiative actually includes two major components. One is institutional support to AFCAC. So this includes hiring qualified experts that will support the mandate of AFCAC as executing agency for the SAATM. So we have an air transport expert that was recruited by the project. We have a competition expert, and we have 3 experts that have been recruited under the project, as well as some administrative staff. So this is supported by the project over the 3 years of project implementation period. In addition to that, we're also supporting the AFCAC in putting in place all the regulatory framework. We're also supporting capacity building for all the stakeholders, and these are the RECs, because the RECs have a critical role to play, but also at the national level, really capacity building on the YD instruments. Because again, you can't really implement something without being familiar with the regulations and the laws surrounding this initiative. We're also supporting the AFCAC in advocacy, because there is a need for communication, for strong communication at all levels, including for the public, because the public has to know what is being done. Because you may even find out that a lot of people have probably heard about YD and SAATM, but they just don't know about it, like what is it all about. So advocacy, communication, so we're investing massively in this activity. Now, the second component of the project is sustainable development of air transport. As you rightly said, should AFCAC be able to deploy all of this, to bring all of the African countries to join the SAATM, then what about safety? What about security? What about environment? And even what about the sustainability of AFCAC itself? Because we are supporting AFCAC for the next 3 years. Then what happens after? So we really have to look at the longer term. And so we're supporting AFCAC in assisting member states to reach the minimum levels that have been set by the Abuja target for safety, the same with the Windhoek targets for security, and also in implementing the ICAO requirements in environmental protection. But one thing that was also innovative with this project is that usually our projects, historically, the bank has supported in this kind of projects only states. And we felt, can we really have a system without supporting the industry? So we thought it was also critical to involve the industry. That's why we allocated some resources for AFCAC with IATA and AFRAA to support airlines to become IOSA or ESA certified, because you can't really envisage an open and growing market without ensuring that the industry is safe. So this was the thinking. There's one thing, and I've heard lots of comments about it. we did restrict this support to member states that are signatory of the SAATM. And the reason behind this is that first, our framework and guidelines state that we can only support states that are members or that are really taking the steps to join the SAATM. So this initiative being about supporting the SAATM and to be consistent with our own framework and guidelines, and also to use it as an incentive, because those member states that have not joined will also see that they are actually missing, they are not benefiting from this support from the bank. And by joining, they would get the benefits of this support. So we really want to encourage, again, those member states that haven't joined to join the initiative, to join the single African air transport market, because the benefits, although I know there is a study being conducted, but the benefits are there in terms of traffic, in terms of jobs, in terms of GDP. The benefits are obvious for those that are members of the single African air transport market.
Oh, thank you so much. For us, on the part of AFRAA, we would want to thank the ADB for actually coming on board and supporting AFCAC so well, not only just for the short term, but also putting measures in place for the long-term support so that the industry can continue to move and realize its full potential. Now, the one thing that we observed, or I observed, conducting these SkyConnect dialogues, is I had the Secretary General of AFCAC, and I also had the Director of Trade in Services from the Africa Continental Free Trade Area on this program. And from both the discussions I had with both, it would appear that there is not a very strong collaboration between these two organizations as they work to implement the single African air transport market and the continental free trade area. And for us as operators, this sort of creates a bit of concern, because what we would want is to have a free market for air transport and a free market for goods and services for Africa. That way, the opportunities then become enormous and are very consistent. As a bank which has the carrot, is there any way you can ensure some alignment in the work programs of these two organizations?
So as I said earlier, the bank is also supporting the Secretariat for the African Continental Free Trade Area. So our intention is really to ensure that we somehow, the necessary dialogue is established. Once the certain project supported by the bank is launched, to ensure that we have the proper synergy so that those two initiatives that actually work hand in hand can really connect, so to say. Because one thing is clear is that the SAATM is a crucial logistic infrastructure and a facilitator for the free trade area. So this has to be, this is recognized by the bank, by the African Union, and also by the Secretariat for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So our intention is actually, because again, the good thing is that those two initiatives being supported by the bank, the dialogue becomes much easier. So we intend, and even when developing this initiative, we spoke and were in contact with our colleagues from the Regional Integration Department. So we will foster this communication with them to ensure that those two initiatives actually move hand in hand, and that we really reconcile as needed to ensure that they recognize each other. And as you can imagine, the free trade area is not just a free trade area per se, but is also a form of integration. So this is really at the higher level an agenda for the bank's president, and aviation, air transport is considered as one of the vectors of this regional integration. So be assured that at all the levels, there will really be this reconciliation to make sure that those initiatives move together. But as you can imagine, there are other supporting initiatives by the African Union that really have to be supported, and the bank is also involved in those. One of them being the protocol on free movement of people and goods, as well as the African passport, because all of this really has to go together so that those initiatives can really develop to their full potential. And we're striving to support those initiatives by various projects and dialogue within the bank.
Great, thank you so much. In fact, you know, whilst when the show is getting interesting, then we're running out of time. So allow me at this point to go to some of the questions that we've got from our audience. And then if you can briefly respond to some of them, and then we can continue if we still have time. The first question is from Jean-Francois. He says, is the African Development Bank open to financing simulators for pilot training? Because there's a need for more pilots on the continent. Do you have an appetite for pilot training? For simulator investment in simulators.
Thank you for this question. I would say simulators fall within capacity building, development of competency, and this has really been in the heart of the bank's interventions in countries, because we consider that, again, without human resources, the aviation will remain weak and will not prosper as envisaged. So the answer would be yes, we are ready to support such projects, provided, again, as I said, they are bankable, they are well, structured, but again, there are some restrictions to it. If it's, we will not support startups, and this is applicable to to most of the financing institutions. But otherwise, we are very open and ready to do that. And as part of most of our projects, actually, what we do, and I've ensured that we always do it, is we always include a capacity building component. Because building an infrastructure, even acquiring aircraft, without ensuring that you have the proper human resources to operate this infrastructure over the long term, is useless. And typically, I will just give an example. The project that we're financing for Côte d'Ivoire, the acquisition of aircraft for Air Côte d'Ivoire, included a technical assistance component for the training of 3 batches of about 15 to 20 pilots, so a total of 60 pilots. But we also looked at developing local capacity to train pilots. So just in a nutshell, training is actually one of the critical elements that we're looking at in all our projects, and therefore supporting the acquisition of simulators inter alia is something that we can consider, provided the project is well structured.
Oh, thank you so much. Now, our second question is from Roland, and Roland says, when will airlines start drawing the financing from the 25 billion COVID intervention support? I think the AFDB committed 10 billion, not 25 billion, Roland. So probably Romain might be able to talk about the 10 billion component.
Okay, so this 10 billion was actually the COVID response facility that was established by the bank. But as I said earlier, the bank is unfortunately not an aviation financing institution, it's a development institution. And our aim is to support our member countries and also the private sector. So out of this 10 billion, a lot of budget support was actually provided to governments, because the 10 billion was actually structured in a way that it would either go to support governments through budget support facilities, or to support the private sector, but only existing clients of the bank. Most of the resources that were, I would say, disbursed or provision for countries were done so through the budget support products. And many countries that received the budget support actually provided a package to their airlines. Côte d'Ivoire is one of them. I know about Senegal, I know about Morocco, I know about Egypt, but all of this wasn't done directly by the bank. The bank provided the budget support to the country, and the country decided on its priorities. What we did was, of course, to sensitize the countries about the importance of aviation in the recovery process. But that's all we could have done at this point, is really to highlight the profile of aviation. But as you can know, there's a competition, because my colleagues from the agricultural sector will say the same thing. My colleagues from the health sector will say the same thing. So it's really about how the government also perceives the aviation sector. So in this respect, there's also an important role for the aviation sector in the country to really highlight its contribution to the economy. And typically, I would like to take the example of Rwanda, where despite the performance of the airline, the country is really looking at the contribution of the airline in the aviation ecosystem. And based on that, they consider that the airline is actually bringing much more than what we can perceive as being the performance of the, of the airline isolated.
Yeah, thank you so much. Another question from Dahir says, do you offer financing for American companies that want to invest in African aviation?
No, unfortunately, the African Development Bank is an institution that is really geared towards financing companies that are established in its regional member countries, because we actually have non-regional member countries, but yet our financing are dedicated to companies based in our regional member countries. So an American company would not be eligible for financing. However, if the financing is for the benefit of the company, if the equipment or whatever is being financed is for the benefit of a company that is based in a regional member country, then this company is eligible to seek financing from the bank, and then we'll consider the request.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Another question is from Nirvan. He says, most aviation financiers have retreated to an area where they will only consider so-called tier 1 airlines. It is near impossible for even a conversation for the financing of sale or lease back of African airlines. How can your bank play a more decisive and leadership role, specifically at a time when aircraft prices are low and offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for African airlines to meaningfully improve their fleets?
So, as I said, first, the bank doesn't want to position itself as a leader in the aircraft financing area. However, as rightly said in this by this listener, the context is such that our airlines would like to take advantage in order to renew their fleet or to acquire more modern or to expand. And as I said, was one to support maybe in the technical assistance, in supporting, in improving the business plan. This is one thing that we can do. The other thing we can do is maybe, again, this really depends on whether the government is supportive of the initiative, is provide some guarantees. So this is actually challenging for those airlines that are privately owned, because it may be difficult for them to have the government involved, but that's unfortunately, that's the reality. And in the mid to longer term, we'll be putting in place this leasing platform, which will really be dedicated to African airlines. And those challenges that our African airlines are facing with, their, communications not being considered, not being responded, should be solved with this solution.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Kwame. Kwame says that you mentioned earlier that the bank has no appetite to support airlines that are loss-making. But what he wants to know is if the bank has any programs in place to improve the attractiveness of the unprofitable African airlines so that they can meet your support requirements.
Program in place wouldn't be the appropriate terminology, because again, resources have have to derive, from one of the instruments that are existing. So typically what we would do is, if there is an ongoing project, we will try to get some leftover resources to support related industries. But to say we have a dedicated fund to support those airlines to turn around their financial performance, the answer is no. However, we have at the bank, we have some trust funds that are there to support initiatives, and those airlines that need support can apply for those trust funds, and they may get the support, but the likelihood is very limited, especially now where resources are rare because of the situation, the economic situation that we're going through. So really, to expect the support from the bank for a loss-making airline directly is challenging as we speak.
Great for that response. Now, our time is up, but I cannot let you go before I ask you my final question, or I give you a final opportunity this time round to give us a key message to the audience who are listening, some of which might be airlines, some of which might be other players in the aviation sector, and some might also be government or government-related entities that are listening to you. What is the message from African Development Bank to the aviation community?
First of all, I'd like to thank you once again, Raphael, for the interesting discussion, and also AFRAA for giving the bank the opportunity to communicate on what we're doing and also what our vision is for the African aviation sector. In terms of key takeaways, one is I'd like to reiterate the commitment of the bank to really play a catalyst and facilitator role in the aviation sector in Africa. Also, I really want to emphasize on the need for us, for the aviation sector, to really develop robust, bankable projects in order to increase their chances and likelihood to mobilize funding from the market. And this is even more true post-COVID, because unfortunately, we still see some actors coming with the same projects as before the COVID, which is not realistic. So we really need to adjust our projects, our plans to the current situation, and probably to even reinvent our business models, because the business realities have significantly changed. Another message, and this is really more to our governments, if we have some states officials, representatives participating in this, is really to recognize the critical role of aviation in rebuilding our economies, not just in rebuilding the aviation industry, but also the economy as a whole, and really to plead for our states and governments to continuously support the aviation sector. The last but not the least is that the aviation industry has been facing challenges over the past years, has been generally loss-making, except for some few airlines here and there, although the other players are probably doing a bit better. But this COVID is actually, this COVID crisis is actually, we should really look at it as an opportunity to collaboratively look at those reforms that we really needed to improve the competitiveness, the resilience of our sector. So let's make this crisis an opportunity to turn around our industry and make it more competitive and resilient for the future. Let's push initiatives like the SAATM. Let's really look deeply into the taxes and charges issues. Let's really push those reforms that will make the aviation sector more competitive, more resilient in Africa, and of course, more attractive for investments for its development. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romain Ekoto, for coming to the show and for sharing with us good thoughts and a way forward for the aviation industry. Unfortunately, time could not allow us to take all the questions, we still have more questions, and probably we would forward these questions to you, and then if you could respond to them and share them back with us, then we could get to those who have the questions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and for participating in this important dialogue. We look forward to seeing you next month during our next show. Until then, bye-bye. And to Romain, thank you very much and God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Bye-bye. And thank you very much to all the listeners as well.